When mentioning the truckers' protest in Canada to people, the most common response is, "What protest?" Now, this is obviously a problem for us, since that answer reveals that the person in question either consumes no media at all, or more likely, consumes only what the mainstream pumps out. Obviously, this is a problem that needs sorting, and it will only be sorted by exposing such people to the kinds of independent media that we watch. So this issue, although one of some magnitude, is one basically of exposure. Huge, but doable. Second only to total ignorance, the next most common response is one of bias. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we are not also susceptible to bias. I know I am. But as evidenced by the response of two people that I have touched upon the subject with recently, is the problem of, dare I say it, disinformation. One bloke was suggesting that the majority of the protesters were, in fact, not Canadians, but Americans. Now, I was on site, and so not really in a position to counter this, other than that to say that I hadn't seen any evidence to support this. But I detected an implication that the protest was not the spontaneous grassroots resistance to the Trudeau government by earnest and freedom-loving Canadians, but instead an incursion by politically motivated, Trump-supporting right-wingers that had hijacked the original, and probably minor, protest. Like I say, it wasn't a long conversation, and we had boring things like first fix electrics to sort out, so we didn't go into this very deep, or for very long, but the impression I got was that, even when it had been reported, a left-leaning slant had been applied when broadcast. So far, so mainstream. But the other response I received was from one of my best and most intelligent friends when I brought it to his attention. It was a text exchange, so again there is no depth here, but the chap in question is someone who understands the philosophical issues at a very deep level. In fact, he has been the person that I have spoken to most often during this whole COVID catastrophe, partly because I use him as a sounding board to help me convince myself that I'm not going mad, and partly because, as he is someone people listen to, I've been trying to get him on side. Anyway, after saying that a mutual friend had also raised the subject, and I'm sure he won't mind me sharing, he said this: "I'm not surprised that the state ultimately is prepared to use its power once you have roadblocks and gridlock in the capital. But this news story should be everywhere as a cautionary tale and basis for discussion of the basic principles of a democracy before things get out of hand here and elsewhere." Now this, like before, suggests that he had not been following this story as closely as I have, and I freely admit that I am obsessed, because there are important details missing. But it brings me to something that has been niggling me since the convoy arrived in Ottawa, namely, what are the limits of protest? Like a lot of people on our side of the aisle, I have been giddy with the idea not only of people fighting back, but fighting back effectively. The convoy couldn't physically be stopped, and that made it exciting. The super powerful state was exposed as being completely impotent in the face of this large, popular and unstoppable uprising. For all its power, having the law, the police, and theoretically at least the military under its control, it could do nothing except watch the trucks arrive and take their place outside Parliament. But having failed utterly to prevent them arriving and recognising their own physical uselessness, they did what every tyrannical regime does in such circumstances. They trampled all over the law, twisted it and bent it to the point that it was almost unrecognisable, and made the protest illegal. One of the things that was so surprising was how quickly it escalated into invoking the Emergencies Act. But we'll come back to that. So what are the limits of protest? We all, at least theoretically, believe that the ability to be able to protest is one of the fundamental benchmarks that we consider when labelling a country a democracy. But this is, of course, often theoretical. If there was one thing that we learned from 2 years of COVID, is that there are many, many people, far more than I would ever have guessed, whose support for protest is gossamer thin. It usually rests upon whether or not that person believes in the protest or not. And we saw that attitude as clear as day during the summer of 2020. Protests were frowned upon and made illegal, don't forget, because of the supposed threat of COVID transmission. Most people, egged on by the government and the media, believed that protest was irresponsible during a pandemic, that we should put our concerns to one side for the moment and get behind the national patriotic effort to defeat COVID. But along comes Black Lives Matter and suddenly an exception is made. Although the transmission of this indiscriminate and deadly disease remained a consideration, racial discrimination was so serious and so abhorrent that even if it was committed by a foreign policeman in a foreign country 4,000 miles away, the fear of infection could, for the time being, be put to one side. So, one thing that was catastrophically damaging to our society, lockdowns, could only be downgraded if replaced by something else, racial strife and division, that was at least or even more damaging. It's hardly the most consistent of principles, is it? Protests, by their very nature, impinge upon the lives of those who are not protesting. And all protests are annoying, particularly so if you don't agree with the protest. The Extinction Rebellion protests are a case in point. They block roads and runways and climb on top of tube trains. It's annoying. Sometimes it's more than that, like when someone is desperate to get to a hospital to see a dying relative before it's too late. Who has the right to do that? It's certainly difficult to justify. And the argument that is always put forward by those who complain about protests is always the same. What about their rights? So what about them? How does one square the circle between those who feel that they have a right to protest and those who just wish to go about their daily lives? And that's difficult, man. Those who never protest probably believe that all those protesting should just go and do their protesting elsewhere. But where? Parliament? And although I have attended too many protests to count outside Parliament, it's usually only gone on for several hours, usually several hours on a Saturday when there is nobody in Parliament to hear us. And when somebody refuses to leave at the end of the day, such as Brian Hoare, who lived legally on Parliament Square for almost 10 years, protesting the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the law was changed to enable him to be removed. Why? He didn't change anything, and the UK remained embroiled in those military adventures for the entirety of his time in the square. They removed him because he became an embarrassment. Almost all foreign tourists who come to London at some point come to see the Houses of Parliament. Now, I don't know if the tourists thought his makeshift camp shabby, but that was the official justification for removing him. But that wasn't the real reason they ousted him. They got rid of him because they wanted to present the United Kingdom as a place that was calm and peaceful and generally quite happy with its democratic government. That it was a country, in the words of John Major, at peace with itself. But it wasn't, was it? It was deeply, deeply divided and remains so to this day. From the perspective of 2022, it was a miracle that his protest was allowed to continue for so long. And so we come to those other Houses of Parliament, this time in Ottawa, capital city of the Commonwealth realm of Canada. For Queen Elizabeth II is not only the Queen of England, she also happens to be the Queen of Canada. The truckers believe that they have the right to protest. They also, like many millions of their compatriots in Canada, appear to believe that their voice is not being heard. As I understand it, Her Majesty's loyal opposition in Canada had done precious little in the way of opposing the government, which is their job. As far as I'm aware, they didn't oppose the lockdowns, they didn't oppose the mask mandates, and they didn't oppose the vaccine mandates. Much like the opposition in Britain, whose sole opposition to the government was to complain that they didn't lock down hard enough, early enough, and didn't impose harsh enough restrictions. So I know how Canadians feel. There has been no opposition to this catastrophe. So what do you do when you have no voice, when you are being ignored? Answer: you make yourselves unignorable. And didn't they just? For almost 3 weeks they parked themselves outside the seat of power, immovable and demanding to be heard. And heard they most definitely were. Within the space of a few days, in the words of Justine Trudeau, they went from a small fringe minority to a threat to national security. A national security threat that cleaned the streets, saw a drastic fall in street crime, fed the homeless, played hockey, launched fireworks, gave kids cotton candy and bouncy castles to play on, sang and danced, and even brought English Canadians and Quebecois separatists together. Something that no Canadian politician has ever been able to do so effectively. Some threat to the nation. We know that they are no such thing. What they are is a threat to the Trudeau government, to the World Economic Forum, and to their plans of coercing a cashless society and a Chinese social credit system onto Canadians without their consent. But the truckers are not elected. They do not, we are told, have the support of the majority. Now, this is contentious, to say the least, considering how opinion polls are manipulated to give the desired answer. But just for argument's sake, let's say that this is in fact the case. What is a democratically elected government to do when confronted with such a protest? They have the legitimacy of having been elected, albeit within Canada's flawed and imperfect parliamentary system. And so, having that legitimacy, are we to conclude that they then have the right to do whatever is necessary in order to bring the protest to an end? They would argue, I suppose, that it is not the protest that is the problem, but the occupation, as they are calling it. Ottawans, we are told, cannot go about their daily lives because of the truckers. The rights of the Ottawans are being trampled on by the truckers. Their complaint is that something is being forced upon them, the disruption of their lives, without consent. This is the complaint of all non-protesting people against protests. Their reasoning, which is reasonable, is that they are not involved in the protest, so why should they be subjected to it? If others want to protest, they can do so, so long as it does not impact others who don't share your views. On the face of it, that's a fair point. However, that rationale would make all protest impotent, since the very nature of protest is to exert pressure on a government to force a change of policy. And yes, there's an element of force there. To some, democracy means nothing more than having a vote every 4 or 5 years. To these people, the only protest that is acceptable is to write to their MP, since anything else has the potential to cause disruption. If we are to accept that that is a sum total of what it means to be a democracy, then we're in real trouble. And we are in trouble, because if Canadian politics is anything like its British counterpart, and it appears to be, then if we don't have an effective opposition, we don't have a democracy. From what little I have gleaned from watching this drama, the Conservative opposition appears to have suddenly woken from its slumber and is now actively opposing the deliberate destruction of democracy in Canada, something that would have been somewhat more effective if they had done so almost 2 years ago. Having no opposition in Parliament doesn't mean that there is no opposition. It only means that opposition will come from somewhere else. So whose rights are more important? The truckers' rights, or the rights of supine and disinterested Ottawa residents? Of course, I've just put a slant on that, haven't I? A bias. But I do so deliberately, and I'll make no apologies for doing so. The truckers are engaged, they are passionate, and they're prepared to take significant personal risks to advance their cause. The Ottawa residents are supine, compliant, seemingly interested in nothing more than their own personal comfort, convenience and safety. As John Stuart Mill said, the person who has nothing for which he is willing to fight, nothing which is more important than his own personal safety, is a miserable creature and has no chance of being free unless made and kept so by the exertions of better men than himself. So that's what I think of the Ottawa residents, or at least the caricature of them, promoted by the mainstream media, since I am sure there are many residents of Ottawa who are fully supportive of the truckers' actions. In this instance, they, the caricature, are the miserable creatures. The truckers, by contrast, are the better men. But my opinion is of no consequence, since we have not yet answered the question of whose rights should be elevated, since even miserable lick-spittle cowards have rights, just as good men do. But this too does in the end come down to opinion. The caricature of the Ottawa resident, and it is a caricature, fostered and promoted by the media and Trudeau's government, argues that his daily life is being unreasonably impacted by the truckers' protest. But the truckers would argue that their very biology is being unreasonably impacted by the vaccine mandate. The disruption to the daily lives of the Ottawa residents, although perhaps tremendously inconvenient, is temporary. If it lasts a month or 6 months, the truckers will eventually disperse, voluntarily or not. The injection of an unknown cocktail of chemicals into one's bloodstream is permanent. The safety and efficacy of the vaccines remain in question and will do so for many years to come. The vaccines may cause illness, disability, infertility or death. The truckers' blockade will not. It will cause inconvenience, at most, at its most negative. Should the truckers not protest for fear of inconveniencing the residents of their capital city? A capital city that is most probably home to a majority of people who work for the federal government and are therefore not predisposed to agree with the truckers anyway. Are these residents, in fact, just government functionaries who had some hand in drawing up the discriminatory vaccine mandate legislation in the first place? Are these Ottawa residents not, in fact, the ordinary Canadians we are led to believe, but instead just a power group working for the government against another power group that is challenging the government? Might it be reasonable to assume that the concerns of residents is merely a cover for government exercising its power by other means? Might it be reasonable to assume that none of this is about rights at all? It is only about power. And as such, it is a struggle. The Canadian state has been extending its power far beyond what is reasonable generally, and far beyond what is explicit in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It has been doing this for almost 2 years, and has been using propaganda and coercion to achieve its aims, believing it could sideline its critics and its refuseniks without serious pushback. And when it got pushback, a pushback so unstoppable it had no recourse. Having been ignored for so long, the truckers weren't about to be bought off, and so Trudeau, having talked so tough, not to mention insulting, had backed himself into a corner, which left him with only one option: to escalate further. And so, with no attempt to placate, mediate or negotiate, he went straight for the nuclear option, invoked the Emergencies Act, or martial law by any other name. But this martial law, unlike all its brutal and repressive forebears, had an added sting in its tail. It gave the government the right to freeze its opponents' bank accounts, and if that doesn't send a shiver down your spine, it means that you are accepting of this, and consequently you are someone who doesn't actually have a spine. But to get back to the original point, one of the ways in which we decide whether or not protest is acceptable is to ascertain whether or not the protesters have popular support. Often what we mean by this is something quite basic. Do the majority agree? Now, despite being basic, discovering the truth of this is harder than it looks, and even when the result is unarguable, calm acceptance rarely follows. Brexit was a perfect case in point. But in the absence of an official referendum, we are all forced to rely on the vagaries of opinion polls. We are told by those who support the government, like the media and, well, the government, that most people don't support the truckers. The support of the truckers, however, insists that the majority do support them. And certainly the about-face of several of Canada's provincial premiers towards the reduction or even the elimination of COVID restrictions altogether suggests that they at least believe that there has been a sea change in the minds of the populace. But little boy Trudeau had a point to prove, and after establishing that he could rely on Canada's policemen, be they local Ottawa or Ontario police, or the famed and previously highly respected Mounties, he sent his troops into battle. He didn't lead, obviously, since he may risk getting his hair messed up. No, instead he sent the goons in. Canada's police, like everywhere else in the so-called free world, have morphed from a traditional civil police force into something far, far uglier. Routinely dressed in black with body armour, cameras, tasers, and now quite brazenly carrying heavy wooden clubs, all the while keeping their firearms in reserve on their hips, they moved against their unarmed and astonishingly non-violent compatriots, punching, kicking and kneeing them, as well as trampling elderly women beneath their horses, essentially for causing a 3-week traffic jam. Now there will be those who will say that if protesters didn't want to be subjected to violence, they should have withdrawn, packed up and gone home. But would they have avoided violence by going home? Would they? So what do you call it when someone is threatening to force something into your body that you don't want? We used to call that rape. And isn't that a kind of violence? One of the worst kinds, in fact. Ask any rape victim. In fact, ask any rape victim who didn't physically resist her rapist because she was afraid of what else her attacker might do, and tell her that she wasn't forced. Tell her that she was consenting. Because that is what the trucker convoy was essentially about. Forced vaccinations. And the truckers, because they are men, decided that this was the point at which they would resist. Because they knew that that hill, on Parliament Hill, had to be defended. And they knew that they would have to defend it unarmed. The truckers had no weapons. No truncheons, no tasers, no wooden clubs, no sidearms, and no colleagues with automatic rifles standing by in case they got overwhelmed. The restraint of the truckers was almost beyond belief, considering the provocations. Just imagine what would have been done and how it would have been portrayed if even one protester had defended himself with a baseball bat, let alone a knife or a gun. Just imagine the headlines and the photographs taken of this violent insurrectionist who had come prepared to use violence seconds before he was overwhelmed by Trudeau's thugs. They wouldn't be taking any pictures of the aftermath, that's for sure. I read some Canadian's comment somewhere that he would not comply and that he would support the truckers because in the wake of the vaccine mandates, he believed that the social contract had been broken. The unspoken covenant that exists between the governed and the governors in all free societies had been broken by Justin Trudeau and his government. They had, not just in relation to the vaccine mandates for truckers, but for all COVID restrictions, trampled all over the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and consequently that he, as a Canadian citizen, was no longer bound to obey these illegal diktats. His responsibility to obey the law was now null and void. Considering the actions of Justin Trudeau and his government invoking the Emergencies Act, enabling them to do what no government anywhere, of whatever stripe, has ever done before in order to impose its will, and the behaviour of Canada's brutal fascistic paramilitary police forces, I believe that another principle has been broken, that of obtaining majority support. Once Trudeau decided to use whatever means was necessary to impose his will, including violating Canada's own constitution, this stopped being about anything to do with principle, even the blunt principle of majority support. When he did that, it became about power, nothing more. Trudeau is not concerned with whether or not his actions have majority support. He is concerned only about maintaining his power. And since it is now about power and not principle, I don't think the truckers or their supporters need concern themselves about whether the majority agree with them or not. They just need to win.